So I'm going to turn to Burcu and ask her a couple of questions, if I may. I mean, in your experience, what are the key features of a successful feedback mechanism? And are there ways in your experience to handle unsolicited feedback and solicited feedback, the point that Francesca was making there earlier? If I could put you on the spot.
Sure, absolutely. Well, thank you for the opportunity to share our thoughts here, and
also speak into the microphone because so we
move
just
closer. And thank you for the study, which is adding to our thinking and growing body of work on seeking and responding to community feedback. I would like to first talk about cultural and structural elements necessary for making our complaints mechanisms work. And then I want to get into some of the nitty-gritty bits of on the mechanisms themselves, if that's all right. In order to succeed in our feedback work, I think we need to develop a culture of listening and openness to feedback in our organizations. That's a no-brainer there. Our staff can be nervous about seeking and responding to complaints and feedback about their work. Therefore, before asking our staff to open themselves up to criticism from communities, we need to provide them with ways in which they can raise their concerns about the ways of our organizations. The same thing applies to our partners. So before even getting to the community, we need to start with our staff and our partners. And this was a learning that hit us very early on when we started looking at feedback work. Secondly, as part of cultural change, we need to increase the demand in our organizations for community feedback. We need to put feedback into the agenda of our program meetings within our agencies, and also in terms of our meetings between us and our partners, and ask ourselves, so what are we hearing from the communities this month? We need to make it part of our program reports. We need to encourage and reward our managers for seeking community feedback. Secondly, we want to create systems that link feedback data with M&E data for learning and continual improvement. The meal approach, the monitoring, evaluation, accountability and learning approach, is trying to do this, and it seems to be working. The best example of the meal approach that I've seen is implemented in our Pakistan offices, and I'd like to talk about it here. In Pakistan, what the team has done is they've set standards for each sector, minimum quality standards. And based on these standards, they've put together short monitoring checklists that include community feedback. So here's your informal mechanism where you've taken your M&E exercise and put feedback element into it. In addition to this, in addition to these monitoring checklists, they've set up formal feedback mechanisms, hotlines and feedback forms and such. And every month they look at the information coming in from the monitoring exercises and the hotline, and they run these monitoring reports. Action points are generated and they're tracked. And at the end of the year, they look at these monthly reports per sector, and they produce an annual meal report. And in this report, they can see the most recurrent issues in a given project. They can see the percentage of action points in each sector that have been acted on. And they can also see, for example, which projects are less responsive to course correction, which districts in a given project are less responsive, and that sort of thing. And through the use of these monitoring checklists, they can get a snapshot of the quality status in projects. For example, on average, our projects are able to meet 75% of the quality standards, that sort of thing. So this to me sounds quite powerful. M&E complemented by feedback data generates action points that are used for course correction. They're all recorded and tracked for learning and continual improvement. And they've looked at the budgeting implications for this, because Francesca, you've talked about resourcing. And this requires staff capacity, obviously, but it has taken about 2% of the overall portfolio in our Pakistan office. So now getting to more of the nitty-gritty bits about the mechanisms themselves. In terms of where to locate the mechanism, whether to locate it centrally or within projects, in my experience, what I've seen is for responsiveness, what seems to work is frontline staff, ideally in addition to M&E staff, in each project collect feedback, feed it to designated staff to record, who in turn pass this information to a centrally located MEAL team for analysis and wider sharing. In centrally managed mechanisms, MEAL or accountability focal points can become very unpopular, however. They can be seen as spies. They're coming to check on our programs. If they find out about corruption, this and that, investigations begin. They're not very much liked. One thing that the Pakistan team have come up with is that when they develop these action points after the monitoring, what they do is, if it's the M&E, the MEAL person that does the monitoring, they make sure to sit down with the program team to decide together on the action points, so they're not alienated. I'll say a couple more things about categories, roles, forms, things like that. In supporting our work in country offices, the feedback we've heard that sharing categories has helped country offices, or for country offices to set their categories of complaints themselves, so they can make sense of what's coming in and analyze and help look at trends over time has been helpful. It's been very helpful to sit down and actually draw flow charts that clarify how the feedback is going to flow from a community member all the way to decision making, clarifying roles and responsibilities, and also where the relevant existing policies kick in. So if we hear about corruption, the fraud and corruption policy kicks in. If we hear about safeguarding issues, safeguarding policy and focal points kick in, and that sort of thing. And it makes it very clear for staff to see that. And it also helps them not to feel too overwhelmed about all these sorts of things that'll come, and they'll have to deal with it, and that's an additional burden on them. In helping record feedback that comes up in day-to-day activities, unsolicited or solicited, the use of feedback forms has been helpful. We've actually put this together especially for unsolicited feedback, for when our program staff are out in the field and they're in touch with community members, and if something is shared there and then, for them to be able to record this and help to make sure that once you write it down, there's more of likelihood that it will be acted on. So there was a question of sustainability that was shared. I think some of what I've said also works for sustainability, creating a culture of listening and openness to feedback, building MEAL systems that link M&E and feedback to decision making, and supporting our partners and local actors in this work, I think are important for sustainability of this work. Is that all right?
It's excellent, thank you. I was just wondering, are you getting different sorts of feedback in terms of the kind of unsolicited feedback you get? Is that different qualitatively to the types of things that come solicited? And so, you've got these people out in the field with forms, catching things. I mean, is the unsolicited stuff more difficult to deal with? Is it? What's the difference? Why is it unsolicited?
I have to say, well, it can be, but we rarely get it. It rarely comes all the way to us.
Yes.
And I don't have a very good sense of how much these feedback forms are being used, to be honest. It depends on, there are some country programs that have designed their own forms and are using them.
Yeah.
And it seems to me from the reports I've seen, that it hasn't been terribly big picture.
Yeah.
And I think it's one interesting point that's come out of this research as a pointer for us to actually look into this. What sort of big picture issues are we getting?
Yeah.
Are we recording it?
Yeah.
And are we acting on it?
Yeah.
So I don't really have an answer. I'm sorry.
That's
but
all
we
right.
want to look into it.
Just
is
another
my
question
answer.
too.
Yeah.
And one very small question from me before we move on to Alex, and it's about, I'm just rather interested about why these centrally managed points became so unpopular. What's going on there? The centrally managed, you
It
mentioned...
doesn't have to be, but yeah, they can.
Why were they unpopular? What was going on?
Because if they are not part of the project team especially, and if they're coming every now and then from a central office to a field office to check on how people are doing, and if they find out some issues, they can become unpopular. We have seen cases where they've been suspended because they got into a disagreement with, say, the program manager because they found something out and that was contentious, and relationships were fragile. So it can be an issue. It doesn't always have to be an issue, and in many offices we do not necessarily have the resources to have many people within each project, so it'll have to be maybe a central team that comes, and we have to navigate these sorts of challenges. But
I can see it's a very delicate situation.
Yes.
Alex, over to you, if I may. What's your take on all of this?